Hi, you're about to watch an interview that I recorded with an archaeologist named Max Bieber. He works in cultural resource management, and so he shares with us how that field looks, what happens in that field, how archaeology is practiced in cultural resource management and why, and some of the interesting things he's had an opportunity to see and do working in that field. The reason I'm doing this little intro in advance is because right before we recorded this interview, my computer went on the blink, and Max had a very narrow time frame during which we could do this interview. So there's some kind of goofy tech things going on. The lighting is weird. I have to switch cameras halfway. It's just like a mess. My dog starts barking. I have to close a curtain. I mean, all kinds of silly things. But I'm apologizing for the poor quality of this production. But Max is fabulous, and he is on point the whole time. So I hope you enjoy the things he has to say.
If it asks you permission to record, let it. Okay, I'm gonna intro us and then we'll chat a little bit. Hi, I'm
Hi.
Angeline, and this is my guest today, archaeologist Max Bieber. Sorry, I'm having some tech
Hello.
issues, so I'm kind of still setting up while trying to talk. And Max and I were just chatting about my trip to the Mojave over the last couple of weeks. I had spent about 2 weeks on the road checking out, and I don't know why this looks so. Anyway, okay. I was checking out and the ancestral Puebloans that reached far, 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 far west into the Mojave Desert, which is really weird because, as you were saying, Max, you didn't think they went that far. So my answer to that was that there's this band or this, the Fremont. They're all up in the Utah.
Yeah.
They call the farmers, the far north southwest, but so essentially it's sort of that same, I don't know, mothership of people, but the Virgin Anasazi were way west, along the Virgin Rivers and the Muddy River, like Las Vegas, in that area, and all the way down to Lake Mead, where I know you went because you were doing some work out there. And
Yeah, it's a little further south than that. I was working in Mojave territory, kind of between Laughlin and Needles area.
yeah.
Yeah. That's super cool though. I never really realized that. I'm kind of new to the Southwest myself. I started off working in the Midwest and then just recently moved back to LA where I grew up.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, that's super cool. The Muddy River there's some natural springs up there that I've heard some about, but I've never actually been up there.
Yeah, you were doing some work with water out that way, weren't you? Or no, that was a little different territory.
I was working pretty close to the terrace of the Colorado River. I'm not allowed to disclose the
I
specific
know.
area. um, but yeah, we were working just kind of on the terrace. We were more interested in lithics while we were working out there. So we were looking at potentially, we were seeing a lot of evidence of harvesting of lithic material from the banks of the Colorado River. Unfortunately, I can't talk too much about that project as it's still in the process of going through everything. So I'm going to be quiet about it now.
Well, so to that point, okay, so the reason you're here today is because you do what's called cultural resource management, public archaeology, right? Is that how you would
Yep.
describe it? While I close that blind because I get too much light in here, will you please explain what CRM is and kind of what?
Yeah. So what I do in CRM. Okay, I'll just kind of talk while you're.
Yeah.
I'll wait a second.
Yeah, keep talking.
Okay, keep talking. Yeah, so cultural resource management. So what I do in archaeology is I work for companies where we get subcontracted out to work on projects in infrastructure and government projects where archaeologies are needed to be consulted. So in projects such as like wind farms, in constructing roads and railways, in mining projects and power projects, solar farms, anything along that, where they're working on government land or taking government funds and might run into issues in managing archaeology sites and disrupting them in construction. So I work as a field technician, so I'm kind of the bottom rung of the ladder, but we go out in the fields and we do surveys where we try to identify the archaeology sites that haven't been previously recorded or surveyed, and then we'll map them on GPS coordinates. And if they can be avoided in construction, that's the best option. And we just will steer the road away from the sites or steer the wind turbine, tell them to build it like 150 yards east or whatever. So they're avoiding cairns on this hilltop. And that's the main goal of it, is just to try to mitigate and minimize the damage to archaeology sites as basically modern life runs into them.
So does it ever come upon where you're doing some kind of research and in your experience so far, have you ever come upon some really interesting thing that just made the whole thing, like, like a mammoth bone or, something where it just brought the whole thing down?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, the types of projects I've been working on, I spent a lot, when I started off in this, I was working in wind farms up in North Dakota. So on a project like that, where you're working in huge open spaces, it's pretty easy to avoid the sites. So when we do find something really cool, which we do find often, we'll find areas where there'll be cairns and lithic matters and all sorts of things. But it's pretty easy just to find the boundary of where the artifacts stop on a project like that, and then tell them just to avoid this area in construction and go around it. So
Yeah.
Generally, I've been pretty lucky where the types of projects I've been working on like have been able to just avoid archaeology sites as we run into them. In terms of like things that have been really cool that I've gone to work on, I've gotten to work on, probably the coolest thing is I've gotten to work on a bison kill site where it was a whole bunch of bison bones up in North Dakota. And we were just, I was involved in the cataloging of the bones, so the sorting and cataloging, and then sending it off to the State Historic Preservation Office in Bismarck. And that was just super cool. We got to see all this evidence of butchery and cut marks and take really, really nice photos. And it was from a site that was up on the Missouri River north of Bismarck, and it was just a super cool experience.
Wow. So I'm curious about this bison. So do you know like what kind of date range you were looking at?
Yeah, this site in particular, we don't have exact dates, but it would have been historic. It was from the end of the 1700s that we are looking at.
That's interesting.
So there was actually some objects in the collection that were metal and that would have been traded from like early European traders to the area.
Like what?
Like metal arrowheads, and we found little bits of metal that were pretty corroded and unrecognizable, but clearly like not of prehistoric origin.
Wow, that's amazing. What else? What other epic things did you find? Anything in particular that stands out as like, you're like, oh my God, I'm so glad I do this job, because I would never have.
Probably the coolest job I did, I think, was in Nevada. I got to work up in Elko County in the Ruby Valley in the foothills of a Ruby Mountain. And
can you give me cities, like how to place that?
It's really, really remote. It's in the northeast corner of Nevada, about 60 miles west of the border of Utah, and like maybe like 150 miles south of the border of Idaho. The closest town would be Elko, Nevada.
Yeah, I think I drove
real.
I think I know where that is. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and anyway, up there, beyond just being like this really beautiful remote area of the country, and getting to spend 2 months out there doing survey, we found just this great collection of lithic points, of projectile points. And it spanned from, I wasn't involved with the work with writing the report up afterwards, so I'm not 100% sure on the date ranges that they all spanned, but some of them were about 1,000 years old, at least, ranging from the Archaic period, and then there are some that were relatively recent in history that were documented as being used up until areas of like the late 1800s.
Mhm.
So that was a really cool experience. Another thing that was really cool up there that we got to see was we didn't encounter this like where we ran up to it. There are some previously documented ones that we got to see. They're called bow trees, and they're these trees where these pinyon juniper trees, where the Western Shoshone who lived there, they would, over a period of like 100 years, visit the same trees, and they would prepare an area of the wood where they would carve out like a section of the wood in the tree, and then it would grow in over a course of like 10 years. This really soft wood that's perfect for making bows. And then they would harvest that wood in a way without damaging the tree, so it would grow back in that same spot, and then they can come back 10 years later and harvest that same wood for making bows. So it would leave a scar in the tree that's recognizable. And that was one of those things that's this like regional feature of the
I
landscape.
understand. So they would mark a tree in a certain way so that they wouldn't accidentally harvest it at the wrong date. They would know when it was time.
So what they were doing is, I mean, like I assume they had within their tribe, they would keep the people who did it would pass on that they were doing this and remember it and come back and visit it at a certain date or whatever. But what they were doing was they were cutting out a section of a tree so that the wood would grow in, and it was this young wood that was like more flexible than the wood that, because it's a new younger wood as opposed to the rest of the tree.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's really interesting. I didn't encounter any of it in the wild, but it's just super cool. Like, I mean, not in the wild, you know what I mean?
I know
I
what
didn't
you mean.
encounter it.
Yeah, I'm
But it
gonna
was
look
a
into
super
that more. I'm gonna have to email you and ask for some details because I still kind of don't understand it. But
I'll see if I can dig up the paper that explains it and send it your way if
That
you're
would be
interested. It's really cool. Yeah. Anyway, it's just one of those things that, like, as you get to move around a lot, you encounter these cool regional things that, because I mean, up in the plains in North Dakota, you don't have pinyon trees, so it's definitely not a behavior that you encounter.
Yeah. Wow, that's so interesting. Well, and what comes to mind when you mention Elko is, so Elko is they've even named a time frame after Elko points. Did you come across that while you
Yeah, the Elko points.
Yeah. And
Strangely, I didn't encounter any of them on the survey in Elko County, but I did encounter them up in Idaho the year previous. Yeah, they're this really cool triangle corner notch points. I like them a lot.
When I was out recently in the Mojave, looking at the Virgin Anasazi stuff, I always try to do research on where I'm going, so I even know what I'm looking at. And that's when I sort of became familiar with the time frames, because no matter wherever you are, they kind of have different names for the time periods, right? So in that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of controversy over like the naming of projectile points within archaeology circles. Like a lot of times, different archaeologists who are more prominent, like the names they use will just kind of stick because they're prominent archaeologists who use it, and then someone else who's prominent will decide something else is a different way, and there's overlapping names and whatnot, and people will have different names to talk about the same thing. But yeah, the Elko point is a really famous one.
What's it called? Oh, the Elko point. Yeah, sorry,
yeah.
I understood you. So to that point, like when you're working out in the field, to what extent do you, I don't know how to, because I don't really know a lot about cultural resource management, which
Yeah.
is why I wanted to talk to you about it. To what extent do you sort of interpret what you're finding?
So interpretation in the field is something that we do for sure, but it's not the forefront of what we're doing out there. The forefront of what we're doing is trying to consult with stakeholder groups and make sure that the resources that are encountered in infrastructure are handled in an appropriate way where damage is avoided to the cultural sites and everything is respected as construction is happening. So it's definitely more of a, like the goal to protect a site, you don't necessarily need to have 100% understanding of the interpretation of it, a correct interpretation. You just need to be able to find the boundaries of where the artifacts are occurring and then be able to like avoid damaging that. And then the issue with interpretation sometimes can be is there's interpretation means a lot to people and it's important to get it right and it can be really, really difficult to get it right. So sometimes, especially in cultural resource management, we're dealing with data sets that are fragmentary as we're not doing complete excavations oftentimes because that's outside of the funding and scope that we have to do. We're just trying to determine what is there. So a lot of times we're just doing the preliminary work of like identifying boundaries of a site and then making a record of the basic material that is there. Like we identified 7 stone features. They appear to be in a linear alignment. We identified lithic flakes, approximately 70% of them are of secondary flakes, approximately 20% are primary flakes, yada, yada, you know? So we're trying to like provide the detail of what's there, but not necessarily, we like the goal isn't to, as people, consultants coming in, we don't necessarily want to say that our interpretation is what is 100% valid of this site. Like we provide recommendations on how to, our goal is to provide a recommendation on how the client should handle the resource, not to provide an interpretation of what that site meant to the indigenous culture that produced the site, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It makes sense. And the question that comes to mind for me is, how do you advise? Okay, so you find some things. I mean, there is a certain level of interpretation that has to happen to even.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean to say that interpretation isn't happening, because it is. A lot of times we consult with tribes on how they want us to handle it. So there's interpretation that's happening, but that's not necessarily, it's like not our goal to produce a report that's dealing with like a public facing interpretation of the site. It can be oftentimes if it's necessary to deal with how to handle the resource. But if you're just like if you're doing like a linear survey and you're encountering an area where you have a lithic scatter per se, and you have a tribal surveyor with you on site, oftentimes they don't even want to tell you what their interpretation of the site is. They just want to tell you how it is protected, because I mean, tribal knowledge is oftentimes not shared with outsiders. So
I see. Okay. Yeah. So so then you have to advise the stakeholders, meaning the person who wants to build a road or a housing development or whatever, about there's something here. We don't exactly know what it is. We don't know really even necessarily who it belongs to, but it's something that needs further study. So you can't dig here. Is that sort of how it looks?
So partly, It's not necessarily just further study. You could just say something is culturally significant. Not that it needs study, just that it's, we surveyed this area with a tribe. We identified three we identified three stone features. Here are the GPS coordinates of the boundary of the site. Tribal surveyors from this tribe determined the site to be culturally important. Therefore, we are recommending avoidance in construction. So you're not necessarily recommending further study in that case, but you are determining that is culturally important and should be avoided in construction.
Yeah. So how did you learn how to recognize what's culturally important? What's in your teaching that lets you identify that?
So a lot of times you just, for a lot of states, there's standards of like what artifact counts are there, of like what has to be protected. And then for projects, I'm usually not involved with this because, like I said, I'm just a field technician. The head archaeologist will determine a scope of a project, where usually on projects, at least on projects I'm involved with, protection goes much further than like what is the minimum requirements. So there'll be a scope of a project that where what we will be doing in survey and how we will treat resources as we come across them. For instance, like in North Dakota, we'll have a scope of a project where we must, any pedestrian survey that's done on undisturbed land, so basically land that's not agricultural fields, a traditional cultural surveyor must be present at that time. And if there's any prehistoric features, it's considered a protected site. And then if there's a lithic count that's under 5, I think, I don't remember the specifics for this project, but lithic count that's a certain amount, the traditional cultural surveyor will have a determination of whether it's a protected site or not. But then there's also like the state standards, which I think in North Dakota might be 5 artifacts makes a site, and under than that is considered an isolate, as long as like they're not like significant artifacts.
Uh-oh, looks like we got frozen.
Facts, by significant, I mean diagnostic, really. It could be disturbed without really penalty. And then there's rules for historic sites also, which I'm not really talking about as well. And historic sites, I'm talking about like Anglo-American sites, basically.
And culturally significant, does that have to do with anything, what am I trying to say, biological fauna, you know, tree stands, like, does that have any?
It can. Generally, like an archaeologist, unless they have very specialized training, wouldn't be the one making that interpretation. There's ethnographic considerations that are taken in as well. But that generally requires more specialized knowledge, and it's not necessarily what I'm involved with. Usually that's, what do you mean exactly by like a funnel?
Okay, so okay, so you're doing cultural resource management, and you're surveying so that somebody doesn't disturb something. And I guess because we're talking about culture, I mean, things like springs, you know, sacred.
Yeah, so stuff like that, absolutely. There's something that's considered like an ethnographic landscape. Okay. So here's something I encountered. There's up in Nevada, there's an area where red ochre occurs naturally, and it's well documented in the oral histories and from historic documents that this area was traveled to for collecting red ochre, and there's religious sites associated with that as well. So any project that would be building a road through there, an archaeologist who's involved would be consulting with how to be managing that as an ethnographic resource, even though like it's not necessarily like you're running into material culture on the site. just a place that is sacred and sacred to the people who have lived there, and that there's documented activity that occurred, but there's not necessarily like a material site that you're protecting in that case. Is that kind of what you were talking
Yeah,
about?
that's what I was talking about. Yeah, because what's okay. So what's making me ask the kind of questions I'm asking is because I'm trying to build a picture in my mind of the scope of people that need to be involved with this.
Yeah,
Like because you need a probably some kind of native monitor. You probably need some kind of
yeah.
geologist. You need some kind of botanist, some kind of historians. You know what I mean? Like, how does that look?
Yes, these projects are often massive in scope. I mean, the environmental side is, there's absolutely like an environmental side of these projects that um, we often work in close concert with them, but they're kind of doing their own thing. But stuff like wetlands and um, then just like faunal and floral resources are protected as well.
Mhm.
Um, but in terms of like the scope of things, it really depends on project to project because it, like you said, it varies so much. Like when I was working up in Idaho, we encountered some prehistoric sites, but 90% of what we were working on was mining sites from
Mm.
um, the early 1900s. So that's not prehistoric in context at all. So it's something completely different. Um, and then, like you said, like I've worked in several different states. So like when you're working in North Dakota or Nevada, it's a completely different context and expertise that's needed. So yeah, I mean, you just absolutely have to be treating projects like with a high degree of particularism. You can't
Mhm.
really have one way to do it.
Mm. It's sort of amazing anything can ever get built. And which
It
is
is.
what kind of leads me into the political aspect of CRM, because you're always hearing stories about how, they want to build a pipeline or they want to build a something. And, then there's all this information and negotiation that has to happen. So for example, they want to just call it a pipeline, although that's kind of a hot topic. I should probably not call it that, but whatever. So they're going to build a pipeline. So then there has to be some kind of discovery period, which is where you come in. Then there has to be some kind of
Yeah.
public revelation of the information period, and then there has to be consultation with stakeholders. And there's so many steps that it's not surprising that people who are ambitious to build might try to I don't know, short circuit or keep keep from communicating everything that's there so that they can get their project done. So is
Yeah.
in what you do, is there any amount of advocacy that's part of your job, or are you simply a reporter of what you find?
So, um, I mean, like I said, I'm relatively new to it, the field, and I've been lucky enough where I haven't really run into situations where the politics of a project have brushed up against the ethics of the archaeology,
Mhm.
um, at least in my case. Um, but I've heard horror stories about it. To a certain extent, like I mean, you want to feel as if your job is to be unbiased and just kind of provide an account of what is there. But like, I mean, I'm a human. I care about like I'm in this field because I care about these sites and like I think it's important to protect them. So um, I don't know. Honestly, I haven't really gotten involved in advocacy too much in my experience. I don't know how I'd handle that in the future. You'd like to think you'd handle everything ethically, but you can't really say, I guess, until you've been in that situation yourself.
So what would you want people to know about CRM? Like just if you, I don't know, you say you're new to the field, so that means that you have a certain amount of maybe you had a certain amount of idealism going into it, or maybe you have fresh eyes, whereas people who've been in it for a long time, they kind of just go about it. What would you like in if you could wave your magic wand? What would you be doing to the field to make it productive, more productive?
Um, it's a good question. I think that most people don't know much about CRM at all. And then when they do encounter it, if you're outside of a field, you kind of view it as bureaucratic red tape. And I'd like people to just kind of understand that this stuff is important to people, you know, it's people's heritage, it's people's past. Even though like a lot of these sites were created like a long time in the past, like it has real meaning to people today, and it could be an important part of people's identity and their culture. And even if people were from the past and everything, it's important to be respectful of what came before. So I understand that like for a lot of people that cutting corners and just kind of not just wanting to get progress done can make people frustrated with like the red tape that archaeologists could cause. But there's an important past that's there, and it's important to be respectful of that.
So you don't really have a magic wand. You would
I don't.
Okay.
No, I don't. I mean, I just think that like, I think like general in our society in general, just understanding and empathy and careful consideration can go a long way.
Do you think you'll stay in
But
this field?
no shortcut. What's that?
Do you think you'll stay in the field of CRM, or are you being attracted in different directions as you go forward?
I'm pretty committed to CRM. I mean, I certainly hope I stay in the field for a long time. We'll see what happens, but I intend to.
Cool. You were recently down in tell me, you were down in Arizona, California border, and you saw
Yeah, I've been.
Grapevine Canyon and stuff.
Yeah, I was down in the Mojave Desert at the border. I was staying in Laughlin, but I made some trips out to Grapevine Canyon and checked out the petroglyphs there.
Well,
It's
just
super,
tell me
super.
for fun. Tell me about some of your travels. I know you were really excited about it and you enjoyed it. What kind of stuff did you see?
Yeah, I'll talk about Grapevine Canyon there. It's just like, so it's at the base of Spirit Mountain, which is the creation point for the Mojave tribe and a lot of tribes on this southern Colorado River. And it's a pilgrimage point. And then there's this canyon where there's this natural spring coming down, and you walk up this big wash.
Sorry, hang on.
And
It's the doorbell rang and my dog's going nuts. I'm going to mute my microphone.
yeah, no problem. And yeah, it's this huge wash, and then you walk up, and it looks almost like to me, it looked like a gate almost, where like on either side, it's this head of a canyon, and it's just covered with petroglyphs. I mean, you would know more about them than I do, but it was just something that was really remarkable to see. And you can imagine, even while it was up there, I was driving into the site I was working at one day, and I saw a bunch of the Mojave tribe in Needles. There's a bunch of kids running down the side of a road southward, and they were driving in pickup trucks behind them. And I stopped and talked to them, and when I was driving by, they were running back from Spirit Mountain to camp out at Grapevine Canyon the night before, and were running back down to Needles. And I was just talking to them a little bit, and they were telling me that this was like basically a coming of age ceremony, and they would done it for years. These kids were relaying it. It's about like 40 miles. But they said that back in the day, they used to run the 40 miles from Grapevine Canyon back to their camp in Needles as a coming of age.
Are you telling me you saw some kids actually in the process of doing this ceremony?
Yeah, they were in t-shirts, and the parents were driving behind in the pickup trucks. It was fun to see. Yeah, but they said they were relaying back. It said maybe one or two of them might do it the whole way, but it looked like most of them were like 12 or 13-year-old kids, and they were relay racing back from across the desert on the side of the road.
That's really special that you had an opportunity to engage with them doing that. And
yeah, it was super cool to see.
were they
yeah,
on one of those trails and one of the traditional trails?
no, they were on the side of a highway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I imagine back in the day, obviously, there's the trails that across the whole Southwest. And that region was well
Well,
populated.
and in
But
that region too, I think it's specifically, I mean, I know they have those trails. You've seen those native trails where they're
yeah,
just like a smoother place across this broader landscape, and they're so narrow. And I believe that
uh-huh.
those trails up there are lined with quartz rocks so that you can see them at night. And
They're
these
reflective at night. They would
yeah,
usually run at night because it's the Mojave Desert. And it's like 120 degrees in the
yeah,
middle of the day. Yeah, it's crazy. There's stories of Mojave runners running from basically like 250 miles from the desert to Chumash territory in 3 days.
incredible.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry to end this, Angeline, but I gotta
I
get
know
out
you
of here
do.
soon.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking this little bit of time to explain what you do, because cultural research management is so far from kind of the nerdy area of, you know, ancient prehistory that I, you know, really focus hard on. And this is a modern practice that you do. So I appreciate the
Yeah, I
opportunity
mean,
to learn more
basically,
about it.
like what I like doing in CRM is I like going out, doing survey, finding sites, getting the boundaries on them, and just trying to like really I just like going out in the middle of nowhere and doing survey. But um, it really it's just kind of doing the work of locating sites and getting
Yeah,
boundaries and trying to protect them from development. Basically,
that's
is
very
what
cool.
I'm engaged in at least.
Well, you and I are neighbors, and just FYI,
Yeah.
next Saturday the 30th, a couple of buddies of mine and I are going out to out in Bishop to go exploring. If you want to join us, I invite you because we have one more seat in the car. So,
Yeah,
let
I'll
me know.
email you about that. That
Okay.
sounds very fun.
All right. Have a great day. Thanks so much for your time. I know you're short on time, so
Okay.
really
All
appreciate it.
right. Bye, Angeline.
Bye.